Welcome to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. Industry updates and best practice to promote, support, develop and protect the Scottish red meat sector.
Hello, I'm Mark Stephen. Round about me at the moment, the fields are full of lambs, and some of them are big and brosy. Others are just wee scraps of things that look like they might blow away, which, to be honest, is a distinct possibility because sadly this isn't really spring weather. We've had bitterly cold wind and sleet and snow this morning. It's really not much of a welcome for anything. The weather is only one of the hazards lambs face. On this edition of the podcast, we're going to be talking about another, worms, and how to control them. Ali Anderson works as National Veterinary Manager at Zoetis, looking after the ruminant antiparasitics portfolio. Ali's interested in finding practical and sustainable ways to help farmers manage worm control and anthelmintic resistance. Graham Mather farms at Shanford Farm just outside Brecon. It's a family farm with cereals, suckler cows and breeding ewes. All the stock are homebred and they're finished on farm. Ali, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you. Give me an overview, please. Which parasites are currently prevalent on Scottish farms?
As we head into spring, which hopefully will improve soon, the first worm we're most concerned about would be Nematodyrus. And this is a worm that is generally affected by the weather quite considerably. What we would expect to see is a hatching occurring after a period of warm weather following a cold spell. So really it does depend on where you are when that is likely to be a problem. Obviously, we would expect that usually to occur slightly later on in Scotland compared to southern parts of the UK. The rest of the worm species tend to sort of spread across the season. They can overlap with Nematodyrus as well, which is just something to bear in mind when we start thinking about treatment. But really, with those different species of worms, majority of them being ones that would affect the gut, so sort of similar clinical signs and that side of things, but different species coming across at different times of year, but all having a similar impact on the lambs we would see. Other things that we do just need to be aware of is that there are parasites that can affect the lambs that aren't actually worms, so would require a different treatment if they were an issue. So coccidiosis would be the main one that could potentially cause some confusion, might see some sort of fairly similar clinical signs, sort of scarring, that kind of thing. But it is just worth checking that we're treating for what we want to treat for when we start treatment protocols and that sort of thing.
Aside from scouring, what clinical signs do you need to look out for and when?
It's interesting, really. The first clinical sign we'd really expect with worms is actually weight loss, which isn't necessarily the easiest thing to spot, particularly if lambs are, out and about and far away. That's why weighing lambs throughout the season is such a great thing to be doing, because that will actually be one of the first things that could be a sign that worms are an issue. Obviously, there are other things that can cause weight loss, so we don't need to make sure we don't ignore all of those. But weight loss due to a loss of appetite, because the worms really suppress the appetite of these lambs. So we'll see reduced feed intake, weight loss, and then the obvious clinical signs that people are used to sort of looking out for would then be scouring, so some mucky bottoms around, that sort of thing. But to be honest, by the time that clinical sign is evident, then it may be too late, or we've already found that a lot of loss of production has occurred due to the worms. And just one thing to add on that, with Nematodyrus, unfortunately, the first clinical sign that can be seen is that we've got dead lambs. And that is because it's the larval stage of that worm that causes the issue. So that's why we try and make use of any kind of forecasting, keeping an eye on the weather and making sure we're treating for Nematodyrus at the right time, because unfortunately you won't see the scarring necessarily. You will just see potentially just some deaths in the lambs as being the first sign that Nematodyrus is causing a problem.
Graham Mather, what parasites are you looking for in your lambs? What do you tend to get?
Nematodyrus is one we look for when we're doing samples. We also used to have an issue with coccidiosis a number of years ago, but we managed to get around that one. We're working a queen grazing system with our cattle. So we graze cattle 1 year, sheep the following year, and switch them around. And I think it's also helping with Nematodyrus as well.
Have you got a system? I mean, is there something that's kind of almost tacked onto the calendar?
We start sampling with the parasite watch, and then we'll be sampling kind of every week to 10 days. So we react on what our results come back.
Ali, how do you go about determining how serious the problem is, how big the worm burden is?
As Graham's saying there, really monitoring fecal egg counts is a really good place to start. Growth rates are really important, but using the growth rate data alongside the fecal egg counting data can be really useful. And I think we're seeing a lot more farmers going down the route of monitoring rather than reaching for a treatment straight away, which is really good to see. And essentially, if you get a good sample, and that's the really, a really key point, is if you get the sampling right, then you'll get a good result, which you can then use to make these treatment decisions. And if we've got a high egg count, then we know we need to treat, and we can then follow those animals through and decide if we want to do a post-treatment check as well, either a week or 2 weeks later, depending on what product's been used. And then that's a really good way of using the fecal egg counting to then check for anthelmintic resistance as well. So that really is a useful tool, and one that it's great to see that more and more farmers are actually using.
If anybody's listening to this, Graham, I think we can reasonably assume that they know what a fecal egg count is. But just in case, talk me through the process. What's involved?
Well, we go out to the field and watch for the lambs' drop-ins, pick them up, getting a selection from across the field, take them back in. And then there's a process, you have to put them onto a slide, and you can view the worms on the slide, and then you get a count back with your results very quickly from when you've put the slides away.
What does a really bad case look like?
With the system we use, it's a very clever system. As Graham said, they process a sample on farm, put it into a slide, and then there's actually a very clever camera that takes a photo of it, which is then uploaded, and then that will be analysed by the company who run it and give us an idea of the worm egg count in that sample. And yeah, a bad sample, when you look at the picture, you can just see a lot of eggs on it. There's obviously a better process that goes on that then counts those actual eggs and gives you an accurate result. But yeah, just in bad samples, you can often see as they're being uploaded onto the system that you'll be ready for sort of some news that you have got a high egg count at that point.
Say that is the case. You've got high egg counts. What do you do about it? How do you treat it? What do you treat it with?
That's a good question. And I think it's one that it really is farm specific. And this is where working with either your vet or advisor, your RAMA, to have a good plan in place for what you're going to do when that situation arises. Hopefully, people will have some idea of what the resistant status is of different actors on their farm. And if they don't, there's plenty of people and information around at the moment that can really help you if it is something you're interested in finding out a bit more about. The choice of drug, if we're focusing just on nematodirus, then a white drench still works very well in most cases for nematodirus. But as I said, we just need to be a bit careful. We know there's a high amount of resistance about to the white drenches in terms of the other stomach worms. And it's, that first drench, you might not necessarily just be needing to treat nematodirus. And this is where, if you've done some fecal egg counts, you've got really good information there. What we've seen in certain years is that people would be expecting just to have nematodirus, but actually they haven't got much of a nematodirus egg count at all. And we've seen quite a high strong gall egg count, so the stomach worm egg count. So in those situations, if you used a white drench and you had resistance to a white drench for your stomach worms, that really wouldn't be the best treatment choice at that time. As we go through the season, choice of treatment, it really is a case of rotating actives in an effort to help reduce the amount of resistance. And again, this is where seeking advice from where you buy your wormers from, who you work with, is really valuable, because ideally you'd have a plan in place at the beginning of the season, working out what's the best thing to use for your farm, because it's not something where you can just make a sort of broad statement that's going to cover every farm. Different weather conditions are going to mean different treatments needed at different times in different areas as well.
The treatments that you use, Graham, do they tend to vary from year to year because of the conditions changing, or do you tend to stick with more or less the sort of same 3 or 4 items?
Yeah, they do vary, but timing varies massively when we're having to do it. And compared to when I was younger, we used to just worm regardless, whereas now we'll maybe get away with one wormer throughout the season if it's a good season to us. And that the saving in labour alone is massive on that.
But essentially, in order to try and stop developing a resistance to wormers, you kind of have to know specifically what it is that's wrong with your animals.
Yeah, that is a big saving as well. But the fact that we do the monitoring, we know when we're needing to go in and worm or not worm. Whereas before we were worming for the sake of worming, and then we would maybe be going back in and worming again and again. Whereas if we monitor it correctly and watch what we're doing, we can get away with one wormer throughout the season, maybe two.
It's just maybe a naive question, but is there any option to actually using wormers? Is there anything else you can do?
Well, like I said, I think with us working our queen grazing system, swapping the sheep and the cattle around annually, it's made a massive difference to what we're doing here.
How do you measure that massive difference? Massive difference in what?
Well, the lambs are doing better. They're putting on weight. There's no coccidiosis issue that we had. We were treating lambs for coccidiosis regularly. We're going out and trying to catch lambs in the field to treat them for coccidiosis. And the vet we had at the time suggested we tried a queen grazing system, and we've tried it and we've stuck with it ever since.
Ali, you mentioned earlier worm forecasts. How do those work? How reliable are they?
The Scops Nematodirus forecast is a really brilliant tool that all farmers, I think, who've got lambs out at the moment should be keeping a close eye on. And they've got data from weather stations, and then they look at the altitude data as well and make a prediction of how likely the nematodirus hatch is going to be happening in certain areas across the country. And it's really great. There's a very simple system. You can look at a map of the UK and it'll just give a really good guide for how likely it is that nematodirus is going to be an issue at that time. And there's also information on there that will help. So if you've got a farm that's near a weather station but at a different altitude, then there's sort of information on there as to how likely that would be to delay the nematodirus hatch. And I think it's just brilliant in this country that we've got tools like that freely available for people to look at.
And Graham, you mentioned Parasite Watch earlier. How does that work?
Parasite Watch is along with Zoetis, and Mark Gwen would come out and take a sample, or I would collect a sample myself, and they're sent away from there. That gives us back what the fecal egg count is, what Nematodirus, Strongyle, whatever comes back in the sample, and that's actually on the Parasite Watch. If anybody logs on to Parasite Watch, they can see what the results of this farm here are and other farms in the UK.
I think a lot of people, Ali, you know, if you talked about antibiotic resistance, whether they're farmers or not, they would understand that, they would get that. You know, wormer resistance, anthelmintic resistance, less well known. I mean, how big a concern is it?
In sheep farming, it is certainly something that has been talked about for a very long time. I hope that there's more and more awareness being raised about it. And certainly there's a lot of stakeholders that do a lot of knowledge transfer in this area. And I think it's something that, you know, when I speak to farmers, it's certainly something that they've heard about, they're aware of, but they're not necessarily then relating that back to their own farm. And I think it's really important that farmers are made aware of it, that they do look at what's going on their own farm, because essentially there's lots of different methods that can be done to help reduce the development of anthelmintic resistance. And I think Graham's given a really good example there, you know, going from what they used to do, where they treated a lot and treated repeatedly, whereas now they can get away with only worming about once a season. And that's fantastic, because essentially every time a wormer is given, you're increasing the risk of anthelmintic resistance developing. So the sort of easiest way to reduce it is to not treat, which obviously isn't necessarily a practical option for people, but it's, you know, using the tools available, monitoring, only treating when necessary, making sure the right products are being given. And I think the sort of simple steps that can be taken if anyone is concerned about anthelmintic resistance is just make sure that when you are using a product, that it's the right product to be using. Make sure animals are being weighed and the dose rates being calculated correctly. Make sure that the equipment that's being used is appropriate for the job, that it's calibrated. So if you think you're giving a certain amount of a product, that you are actually giving that amount as well. The important thing is what practical steps can be taken on farm. So the issue we see with anthelmintic resistance is when it's developing, it develops gradually over time. So people could be using a wormer, and if it's over 90% effective, we would say that wormer's working okay. If we get down to this wormer's been used a bit more and it becomes about 70% effective, well, if you're dosing those animals, you probably won't notice that you've got some resistance developing. It's only once that worm active becomes less than 50% effective that you're likely to start seeing that you've got an issue. You know, you'll treat the animals with it and then won't see any kind of real improvement after it's been given. But the trouble with that is that it's then very hard to do anything to manage that anthelmintic resistance in that product. If we catch it earlier on by doing some drench checking, using the fecal egg counts as we were describing before, then you've got an option to rotate your actives and do some management, field management, other bits and pieces as well. There's lots of different options of how we can then help reduce the development of that resistance.
But just to summarise this, Graham, essentially it is key to know what your problem is, specifically what your problem is, what it is you're actually dealing with, and only treat when you have to, and as the absolute bare minimum to actually get the job done.
Yeah, knowing what you're treating, what product to use, and also I think having a follow-up fecal egg count afterwards to see that the product has worked. We've done that with Nematodiris and also when we've been doing fluke in the breeding sheep, and that's a big thing to know that the product you've used is working and that you've not got a resistance to it on your farm.
Thank you both very much for speaking to me. Ali Anderson, thanks for your time.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
And Graham, thanks for your time too.
Thank you.
If you would like more information on worm control in sheep, QMS have developed a booklet in collaboration with AHDB and HCC named with quite staggering originality, Worm Control in Sheep. So head over to the QMS website for more information. We'll be back in a few weeks with another series of podcasts, this time with more of an international flavour. Until then, I'm Mark Stephen. I hope you found this useful.
Thank you for listening to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. For news and to listen back to previous episodes of the podcast, visit qmscotland.co.uk. For Scotch beef, Scotch lamb and specially selected pork recipe videos and inspiration, visit www.scotchkitchen.com or follow Scotch Kitchen on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter.